May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Good morning. This morning's gospel lesson invites us again into the world of parables. Actually, for the second time, since Matthew's parable of the sower and the seeds was told last Sunday. This Sunday, we're invited to engage with a second parable found only in the Gospel of Matthew, the wheat and the weeds, sometimes called the wheat and the tares. As with all parables, this one has many, many layers of meaning, and they're revealed slowly if you take the time to study and reflect on them. Jesus tells a story using images that would have been familiar to his listeners. Sowing seed, the workers in the field, an enemy who has some grudge or simply wants to create mischief for a landowner, the landowner himself, and what kind of decisions he will make. The images that Jesus has used in this particular parable would have had his audience nodding their heads in agreement. Well, of course, the landowner sowed good seed. Well, of course, the landowner would have taken care of his property and what he was doing. Oh dear, that landowner must have had an enemy, someone who was so angry with him or wanted to cause so much mischief as to ruin an entire harvest of grain. But the landowner does something surprising. His workers are ready to just wander through the field trying to pull up those weeds. The landowner knows that that is not going to be the solution to this situation, and the landowner decides to just leave them until the wheat and the weeds grow together in order for a strong and vibrant harvest, even in the midst of the weeds. And the listeners to Jesus' parable would have wandered off, interested in what he had to say, with a vibrant image in his mind of an enemy causing some trouble. Jesus' disciples ask him for the deeper meaning, and they take him aside. I wonder if maybe they're a little embarrassed that they couldn't figure out what Jesus meant by his parable. I often imagine Jesus sort of sitting down, taking a deep breath, and thinking, I can't believe I have to explain it to these guys yet again. How long have we been wandering together that they can't figure out these simple stories that I have to tell them? And Jesus invites them into a deeper reading of the parable, a reading of the action of evil into the world, the way in which God operates in the world. Jesus reminds them that evil is going to be present, that there's not a whole lot we can do to make a difference. What we can do is know and believe and hold that God is also present in that place and in that time. I think that is the lesson of the parable for us. Most of us are not farmers. We're not too concerned about our harvest. If you like to grow your own vegetables and you've been gardening this summer, you have probably been battling weeds and looking forward to the harvest. But we are invited to place this parable in the context of our own lives. In the time that we're living through right now with the COVID, with the unrest and the murder of Black men and women in our midst, we are invited to overlay our lives with this parable and ask ourselves, what does it have to teach us today? This week, I think I experienced some of what this parable has to teach us. I was at the funeral home for a visitation for the spouse of one of our clergymen. And his spouse had died very suddenly. And it was so hard to be there, unable to really greet people, unable to hug or even shake hands, unable to see the full face of people covered up by their masks, looking at the tape on the ground at the funeral home to make sure that we were staying appropriate distances apart, trying to offer heartfelt condolence and support. And yet, in the midst of that difficult and awful place and time, there was still love in that room. There was still the sense of gathering. There was still the reminder that in the midst of evil and hardship, there was still love and caring. There was still support and solace. And I think this is where we are right now. Maybe this parable means more this year than it does most years when it comes around. Because we've all been living through a time of hardship. I would even call it an evil time. A time when people are suffering all over the world. A time when people are sick and dying and we can't see the end of it. A time when people have lost their jobs. When people are stressed and the anxiety level has reached a pitch that makes it sometimes hard to get up in the morning. We are living indeed through an evil time. But what the parable tells us is that in the midst of that evil, there is also goodness. There's also gift. There's also the possibility and constant reminder of God's goodness flowing through us and among us. One of the privileges of being the regional canon is that I get to drive around the southern region of the diocese and visit parishes and meet with vestries. I haven't done that for a while, but I'm looking forward to getting back to it at some point. I've had the opportunity to hear about the mission and ministry of so many parishes, of all the ways our parishes serve their communities. And while some of that has stopped, much of it has not. Our parishes continue to feed their communities, to provide paper goods and diapers and wipes. Our parishes continue to reach out to the lonely, to those who are struggling. Our parishes continue to try and find ways to support those who've lost their jobs, those who are struggling with children at home, those who are lonely and afraid. In the midst of the evil time, goodness continues to wrap itself around our communities, continues to flow from us and through us, continues to invite us into this amazing engagement as the people of God. In the midst of evil, there is still goodness. There is still possibility. There is still God and God's blessing. My invitation to you this week is, how are you going to be the hands and heart of God this week? How are you going to be the goodness in the midst of evil? Our parishes continue to thrive in being places of goodness and caring. And that is so much who and what we are called to be as Christian people. Every time we care for a neighbor, every time we put groceries in the trunk of someone's car or prepare a takeout dinner, every time we check up on a friend with a phone call or a note, we are the goodness in the world. Every time we gather together on Zoom or on Facebook for conversation, for Bible study, for continuing to learn from one another and hear about God's goodness in the world. So how will you be the wheat this week? How will you continue to grow and flourish, even in the midst of hardship and evil? Amen.